He posted a job ad for farm workers until 5 alien widows came begging for shelter on his farm. The storm was at its peak when Kane Rourke heard the knock at the gate. The sound was faint under the roar of rain on sheet metal, but distinct enough to cut through the night. He pulled on his heavy coat, set a lantern in hand, and crossed the mud-slick yard. Each step sank into cold water. He was tired from a day's work, but the weight in his chest sharpened. Uninvited guests at this hour usually meant trouble. Kane was a man in his late 30s, a farmer by trade now, though his movements carried the memory of years as a Federation scout. His broad frame and scar above one brow hinted at battles long past. He valued order, privacy, and the simple structure of farm life. Plant, tend, harvest, repeat. This land on Seraph 9 was his refuge, far from politics and war. His mission here was survival, but survival on his terms. Clean work, honest rules, no debts he couldn't pay. The gate creaked as he unlatched it. Lightning split the sky and illuminated 5 women standing close together. Their blue skin glistened with rain. Their white hair clung in wet strands across their shoulders. They wore remnants of ceremonial wraps, fabric once fine, now shredded, clinging to their bodies in strips. Their eyes told more than their clothes. Fear held deep, pride trying to stay intact, and exhaustion pulling them down. The one at the front spoke, her voice controlled despite the tremor beneath it. Shelter, just for tonight. Kane studied them. They were too exposed for traders, too organized to be wanderers, and too desperate to be pretending. He thought about the food reserves, the beds, the whispers this would spark if neighbors saw them. But he also saw the cold in their lips, the fatigue in their stance. His decision was made in silence. He stepped aside. Inside, watched the mud. They moved as a group, careful not to slip on the stones. Kane kept the door wide. Heat from the stove rolled out into the wet night. They passed him one by one. The tall one who introduced herself later as Nyril, eyes sharp and wary, Syrian, slender, watching everything with a teasing grin despite her shivering. Thyrene, muscular, her posture firm even in exhaustion. Illyria, smaller, delicate, moving with quiet care. And Valeth bold, gazed direct, as if testing him with every step. Inside, the women halted near the stove, dripping water onto the floorboards. Kane set towels on a chair and pointed hooks along the wall. Dry off. Sit. I'll bring food. He moved to the kitchen, his mind racing. 5 strangers. Blue-skinned widows, by the look of their wraps. Warriors' wives, perhaps, displaced by war or famine. He had expected hired hands from the job post on the colony board, but the translation must have twisted. His ad for field help could have read differently in their tongue. He cursed himself for not double-checking the wording. Now, they were here, and their eyes told him they had nowhere else to go. When he returned with bowls of stew, Nyril finally spoke again. You're Kane Rourke. He nodded. Farmer. Posted for workers. Expected hands, not guests. Our reading said household wanted. That's why we came. Her calm tone masked nerves, but Kane could see it. The small twitch at her jaw, the way her fingers tightened on the towel. They feared rejection more than the storm. Misread or not, Kane said, setting the bowls down, you can stay. Food first. We're tomorrow if you want it. The room warmed with the smell of stew. Steam fogged the window. They ate slowly at first, as if waiting for him to change his mind. Syrian coughed on the spice and laughed weakly. Too strong. Before eating more, Valeth kept her eyes on him between spoonfuls. Illyria hummed a faint tune as she swallowed, soft and careful. Thyrene ate with disciplined steadiness. No sound, no hesitation. Kane observed each, cataloging details. Soldiers did this without thinking. Measure posture, breathing, reaction speed. These weren't helpless women, but they were stripped down to the bone by hunger, grief, and weather. He kept his voice steady, controlled. They needed stability more than pity. There's a spare room down the hall, he said. Mats, blankets. Stove will keep heat. Close tomorrow, dry once. No one here owes me anything. Valeth tilted her head, testing him. Men always ask for something. Kane met her gaze without flinching. Not here. Eat. Sleep. A long silence followed, broken only by the tick of the stove. Nyril finally inclined her head. Then we will work for you. Tomorrow. Kane didn't argue. He only gave a short nod. His rules were simple. Clear lines, no debts, no games. In his gut, he knew this would complicate everything, but the decision was already made. He wouldn't send them back into the storm. Later, when they filed into the spare room, Kane lingered in the hall. He listened as blankets shifted, as whispers passed between them in their own language. He caught fragments, fear of being turned away, gratitude none dared voice too loud, and a fragile relief settling like a fragile truce. Back in his own room, Kane sat on the edge of his bed, boots dripping mud on the floor. He replayed the night in his head, the storm, the gate, the 5 figures waiting. He had wanted workers. Instead, he had taken in 5 widows with no promise of where this would lead. Part of him feared the talk it would stir, but another part, quieter, deeper, felt something else. A pull he didn't name. Outside, the storm thinned to a steady rain. Inside, the farmhouse held 6 lives instead of 1. The silence felt different now. Not empty, but waiting. The storm had broken by morning. Sunlight spilled through the thin curtains, cutting across the wooden floorboards. The farmhouse smelled of damp fabric, wood smoke, and stew left cooling in the pot. Kane woke early, as he always did. He washed, shaved, and pulled on clean work trousers. His body moved through the rhythm of habit, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The spare room. 5 women, blue-skinned widows who had arrived in the rain. He had let them in, fed them, and given them a place to sleep. Now morning had come, and with it questions he hadn't answered. Who were they? Why this place? Did they plan to stay longer than one night? And could the farm hold the weight of 6 lives instead of 1? He stepped into the hall. The door to the spare room stood slightly open. He heard the low murmur of voices in their tongue. Soft, clipped, words carried on a rhythm he didn't know but could feel. It sounded cautious, like they debated something important. Kay knocked once. The voices cut. Nyril opened the door. Her hair, long and white, was combed back and bound with a strip of cloth. Her eyes were steady, but her shoulders betrayed fatigue. She had slept little. Breakfast soon, Kane said. His tone stayed flat, practical. Nyril nodded. She stepped aside, letting him see the others. Illyria folded the blankets with neat precision. Cyrian leaned against the wall, hair loose, giving Kane a grin that was more curious than mocking. Valeth sat cross-legged on a mat, sharpening her nails against the edge of a belt buckle, her gaze direct, challenging. Thyrene tied her hair into a knot, her posture still carrying the weight of someone trained to endure. They had dressed in the spare shirts and trousers Kane had set out, but each wore their torn ceremonial wraps over the clothing, as if refusing to let go of what they once were. He noted it without comment. Pride mattered. In the kitchen, he set bread, dried fruit, and hot porridge on the table. They filed in, each quiet, each watchful. Spoons clinked against bowls. Kane broke the silence first, deciding the questions had to be faced now, not later. You read my job post as household wanted. Why did you leave your last home? What brought you here? The room stilled. Vela spoke first, sharp and open. We are widows. The war took our husbands. Our homes became debts, stripped from us. No family, no protection. We came here because no one else would take us in. Cyrian leaned forward, voice lighter but edged with truth. We saw your notice. You asked for hands. We thought, maybe you would not care who those hands belonged to. Kane met her gaze. You thought right. Nyril set her spoon down. Her tone was calm, but her words carried weight. Understand us, Kane. We are not beggars. We will work. We will earn. Shelter matters, but dignity matters more. Kane gave a small nod. You'll have both. Work is here for any who want it. Food, clothes, a share of harvest. No bargains beyond that. You're safe under this roof. I don't trade in anything else. Illyria's voice was soft, almost hesitant. We will not be forced to leave when someone comes asking. Kane turned toward her, steady, deliberate. No one decides that but me. And I don't throw people into the rain. Relief flickered across her face. She bent back over her bowl, shoulders loosening. Thyrene spoke next, her tone blunt. "We're strong. We can mend, lift, carry. Don't mistake us for fragile." "I don't," Kane said simply. The questions that lingered for listeners: how had these women survived before arriving, and why trust Kane at all, were answered not in long speeches but in the details. The war took their families, debts forced them out, and they came because his words on the colony board promised something other men would not offer: safety without a price. After breakfast, Kane laid out the day's work. Fields need clearing. Fences checked. Tools oiled. "I'll show you how things run here." Valeth smirked. "So we are workers after all." "You came for a place," Kane replied. "Work keeps it running." Cyrian stretched her arms and laughed lightly. "Then let's see if we're worth the trouble." The day began with labor. Kane led them across the fields, damp soil sticking to their boots, rows of crop glistening under the twin suns. He showed them the irrigation lines, the greenhouse door, the broken hinge that needed oil. He moved with calm authority, steady and clear. They followed without complaint, each testing the weight of the work. Thyrene shouldered a sack of seed, as if proving a point. Illyria knelt to check soil with delicate hands. Cyrian teased Kane about his stubborn harrow, only to flinch when it snapped against her grip, then laugh it off. Valeth leaned too close when he explained the tractor controls, her eyes sharp, gauging his reaction. Nyril worked silently, measuring the system with a calculating eye. By noon, sweat ran down Kane's back. The widows' faces showed strain, but also resolve. They were not soft. They had endured worse. He watched them, and he saw something shift. The fear from last night dulled, replaced by focus. When the sun dropped, they returned to the farmhouse. The air inside was warm, thick with the smell of stew. For the first time, there was laughter, not loud, not careless, but present. Kane sat at the head of the table, saying little. He watched, listened, and felt the weight of his decision settling differently now. This wasn't charity. It was the start of something he couldn't name yet. That night, when the women settled in their room, Kane stood at the doorframe and caught Nyril's gaze. She didn't speak. She only gave a small nod, an acknowledgement that trust had begun to form. Kane returned the nod. In his own bed, he thought about the future. He had not asked for them, but they were here, and already, the silence of his farm felt less empty. The mission of his life had been survival. Now he sensed it shifting toward something larger, heavier, but not unwelcome. The following morning broke with a sharp chill, the kind that lingered after a storm. Mist rolled low over the fields, carrying the smell of damp soil and wet grass. Kane stood on the porch, arms folded, scanning the land. He had slept less than usual, thoughts circling back to the same points. 5 strangers under his roof, widows with no clear path forward, and the fact that his farm, quiet, ordered, was no longer his alone. He didn't regret opening the gate, but he knew decisions like these had ripples. Neighbors would talk, workers would notice, and questions would rise. He needed to know more about them, their skills, and their intentions before the whispers reached him secondhand. When he stepped back inside, the women were already awake. Nyril was helping Illyria hang the damp clothes from last night along the line by the stove. Valeth leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, eyes following Kane with a directness that was deliberate. Cyrian sat cross-legged on a chair, braiding her hair loosely, and smirked when Kane's glance passed over her. Thyrene stood by the window, posture straight, scanning the fields as if she were still on some unspoken watch. Their behavior raised questions Kane himself had avoided asking. Had they been soldiers' wives only, or had they fought themselves? Their movements, measured, purposeful, suggested training. He broke the quiet. We'll need to talk about work schedules. This isn't a charity house, but it's not a barracks either. Everyone contributes. Everyone has their say. Valeth tilted her head, amused. You sound like an officer. Used to be, Kane answered. His tone was even, but his eyes didn't waver. Not anymore. That statement seemed to settle something. Cyrian laughed lightly. That explains the rules. Nyril cut in, her voice calm, almost firm. Rules are not our problem. Trust is. We need to know this roof won't vanish the moment gossip starts. Kane leaned against the table. You'll hear the gossip soon enough. People will say, I keep 5 widows for myself. They'll wonder what you pay me with. The answer is simple: work and respect. Nothing else. They'll get bored once they see nothing scandalous happens here. Illyria, quiet until then, spoke up in a low tone. And if someone decides to interfere, if they demand we leave? The question hung in the air. Listeners would have asked it too. How secure were they really on a farm owned by a single man? Ken looked straight at her. This land is mine. The farm is mine. No one makes decisions here but me. If they try, they'll find the gate locked. He said it plain, without bravado, and it worked. Illyria lowered her eyes, visibly relieved. To break the weight in the room, Kane pushed a set of tools across the table. Today we'll split work. Fences on the east side need patching. Soil by the greenhouse needs turning. If you're not ready for field work, you can help with repairs inside. Choose what suits you. The day unfolded as a test for everyone. Kane paired Illyria with him on the greenhouse soil, showing her how to work the rows without crushing the seedlings. She was precise, steady, asking short questions when she didn't understand, her eyes bright with determination to prove useful. Cyrian joined, but less to help than to watch, teasing Kane about his silence. You don't like talking much, do you? She said, leaning on the shovel. Kane only answered, talking doesn't grow food, which made her laugh and dig with unexpected energy. Thyrene took the heavier work alone, hauling fence posts across the mud. Kane noted her pride, the way she refused help even when her shoulders strained. She wasn't reckless, just unwilling to look weak. Nyril spent the morning mending tools, her focus sharp, movements efficient. She worked like someone used to maintaining order when everything else was collapsing. Valith lingered near Kane more than once, asking questions that weren't always about farming. Why did you leave the Scouts? Do you regret it? Her voice carried both curiosity and challenge. Kane kept his answers short, careful, but her persistence left the air charged. By evening, the group returned to the farmhouse tired but less guarded. Small cracks had formed in the silence of the past 2 days. Cyrian joked about Kane's serious face. Illyria smiled shyly as she showed the row of seedlings they had saved. Thyrene admitted with a dry tone that the fence would hold for now. Even Nyril, measured as she was, allowed herself a faint nod of approval as she placed the repaired tools back on the hooks. During dinner, the unspoken question finally surfaced. How long would they stay? It came from Illyria, though her voice trembled as she asked. We've nowhere to return to. If we stay, will there be room for us here? Not just tonight. Not just until the work ends. Kane put down his spoon. He looked at each of them before answering, weighing their faces. If you choose to stay, then this is your place too. I won't put you back on the road. But you need to be clear, it won't be easy. It's long days, constant work, and no guarantees beyond what you see here. That's the truth. The room went still. Nyril's eyes softened, tension leaving her shoulders. Thyrene gave a short nod, more acceptance than agreement. Cyrian grinned and raised her mug like she was toasting. Valith smirked with something unreadable in her gaze. Illyria exhaled quietly, as though she had been holding her breath since they arrived. That night, Kane checked the locks, walked the perimeter, and stood a long time by the porch, listening to the quiet hum of the land. Inside, the widows spoke in low voices, not afraid anymore, but planning. Kane understood then that this wasn't temporary. The farm had shifted. His solitude was gone, and something new, messier, heavier, but alive, had taken its place. He accepted it with the same discipline that had carried him through war. Survival wasn't just his mission anymore. Now it included them. The farmhouse settled into a rhythm, but it was a new rhythm, one Kane hadn't lived with before. The third morning began with a sky clear enough to show both suns over the fields, light pouring through the mist and drying the mud left by storms. Kane rose before the others, as always, and brewed a pot of strong tea. He thought of the questions left hanging from the first days. What had these women lost? Did they carry ties that might drag them back into the conflicts they escaped? And perhaps the most pressing, could they truly live here as more than temporary workers? He knew listeners would be asking the same. When the women entered the kitchen, The answers came slowly through their actions. Illyria was the first to speak, voice steady though quiet. We were not given a choice when we left our homes. Our people declared us property after our husbands died. Widows belong to no one, so they're cast out. That is why we came here. Her words were calm, but her hands trembled as she folded a cloth. This was something Cain hadn't asked directly, and something the others hadn't explained. It was truth stripped bare. Cain's jaw tightened. He had seen governments and factions strip people of worth with cold rules. But hearing it said aloud in his kitchen sparked a heat behind his eyes. "Not here," he answered. "No one here belongs to anyone." That statement, plain as it was, quieted the room in a way food and warmth had not managed before. The day's work pressed forward. Cain assigned tasks, trying to balance their pride with practicality. Thyrene carried fenced timber again, her muscles taut as she forced herself to lift more than necessary. Cain saw it and stepped in without comment, bracing one end until she realized he wasn't trying to rob her of dignity, just making the job faster. For the first time, she let him. Inside the farmhouse, Illyria focused on repairing fabric, turning scraps of wrap into useful belts and straps. She worked with precision, humming under her breath. Cain passed through once, paused, and asked, "Who taught you to sew like that?" She hesitated before answering. "My husband was a soldier. I mended his gear." The air shifted. It was the first time any of them had mentioned the men they had lost. Cain didn't press. He only said, "You'll make the place stronger," before walking back out. It was enough to draw a faint smile to her face. By midday, sweat beaded across Cain's forehead. He worked alongside Cyrian near the irrigation lines. She teased him constantly, testing his patience, her voice laced with mischief. "You know, most men would try harder to impress us." Cain grunted as he tightened a joint. "Most men talk too much. Work talks louder." She smirked, leaned closer, and let her hand brush his forearm, just briefly. The touch lingered in the silence. She laughed as if it were a joke, but the look she gave him wasn't playful. It was measuring. Cain kept working, but his chest tightened with a heat he hadn't felt in years. As evening drew in, Cain noticed how the farmhouse had changed. The spare room no longer sounded like strangers murmuring in an unfamiliar tongue. Their voices carried warmth, laughter even. The smell of stew mixed with the scent of damp fabric drying near the stove. The air felt lived in, not temporary. After dinner, Valeth lingered behind when the others returned to the spare room. She leaned against the table, arms folded, watching Cain stack the bowls. "You've given us shelter, food, rules, but not one question about what we can give you." "Why?" Cain didn't look up from the bowls. "Because survival doesn't start with debt." Her gaze stayed fixed on him, sharp, deliberate. "Most men wouldn't think that way." "I'm not most men." For a moment, the room went still. Valeth's lips curved into the faintest smile before she turned away. It wasn't surrender. It was acknowledgement. That night, as Cain made his final walk of the perimeter, the farm felt different. It wasn't only his anymore. He could sense their presence even from outside. The sound of movement in the spare room, a window opening, a soft laugh carried through the quiet. He stood on the porch a long time, his arms folded, eyes on the stars above Seraph 9. He knew then what listeners might have been asking. Would these women simply pass through, or were they becoming part of this place? The answer was clear now. They had nowhere else to go, and Cain, despite himself, was no longer a man living alone. The first lines of intimacy, of trust, had been drawn, not through grand gestures, but through small touches, shared labor, and words spoken in the plainest way. When he finally closed the door for the night, he didn't just hear silence. He heard a house settling into something new, messy, uncertain, but alive. The farm had begun to change, and Cain no longer tried to convince himself it hadn't. The first sign came at the market. Cain drove the old truck down the muddy road into the colony square with Nyril and Illyria riding in the back, baskets balanced between them. The weekly supply run was routine: grain, salt, fuel cartridges, the odd tool he couldn't make himself. But this time, when he parked, the shift in the air was immediate. People stared, not at Cain, at the women stepping out of his truck. Nyril carried herself with calm dignity, even as eyes followed her. She didn't shrink, but her jaw set tight, like she had expected this. Illyria walked slower, close to Kane, her gaze fixed on the baskets in her hands to avoid the looks. Their blue skin and white hair drew attention instantly, but it was their presence with a human man that fueled the whispering. Kane kept his face blank. He wasn't new to scrutiny. He'd had years of it in the Scouts, learning how to stand steady while others tried to measure him. He paid for grain, loaded it onto the truck, and ignored the muttered comments drifting across the stalls. One man, broad-shouldered and loud, finally made his voice clear enough to reach him. 5 widows, Rourke? Brave or just greedy? Nyril stiffened. Illyria lowered her head, cheeks flushed dark. Kane turned, lifted the sack he was carrying onto the truck bed, and faced the man directly. His tone was steady, flat. 5 workers. 5 partners. More food grown, more work done. He let the silence stretch before adding, plenty of room. The man smirked but said nothing else. The crowd turned back to their business. For Kane, it was proof of what he had told the women. Gossip would come, but only mattered if he gave it power. Still, as he climbed into the cab, he caught Illyria watching him with wide eyes, her hand pressed against her chest. The drive back was quiet until Nyril finally spoke. It won't end here. They will keep talking. Kane shifted gears, eyes fixed on the road. Let them. Talk doesn't break soil. Talk doesn't build fences. But it can turn into action, Nyril pressed. You know this. He did. He'd seen whispers sharpen into knives before. But this was different. The colony had no authority to drag people from homes. The only power it held was pressure and rumor. His farm was his, bought with his own hands, built with his sweat. If anyone wanted to test that, they'd learn quickly how stubborn he was. Back at the farmhouse, the mood was lighter. Cyrian teased Illyria for blushing in the square, and Valeth made a joke about Kane claiming them as if it were nothing. Thyrene, however, stayed silent, her expression harder than usual. Later, when Kane found her repairing the fence post outside, she spoke without looking up. If they come, I'll fight. Kane crouched beside her, steadying the post while she hammered. They won't come. You can't promise that. I can promise if they do, they'll find more trouble than they want. Thyrene's eyes flicked to him then, reading his tone. After a pause, she gave a small nod and returned to her work. That evening, when they sat together around the table, something shifted. Illyria, who had been the quietest since arriving, finally voiced the fear that had lingered in every glance and pause. If we stay, will we always be outsiders? The question silenced the room. Kane set down his cup, leaned forward, and spoke so there could be no misunderstanding. You're not outsiders here. Not in this house. Not on this land. Anyone who tries to say otherwise will deal with me first. The words landed heavy. Nyril's shoulders eased just slightly. Valeth smiled to herself. Cyrian grinned and raised her mug as if in toast. Thyrene's hand brushed the table, not quite reaching for Kane's, but close enough that the intent was clear. And Illyria, for the first time since she'd arrived, let out a breath that didn't carry fear. Later, as Kane walked the perimeter beneath the twin moons, he thought of what he'd told them. The truth was simple. The farm was no longer just his. He had given his word, and that meant defending it against more than storms and broken fences. He wasn't entirely sure what shape this life was taking, but he knew one thing for certain. Turning them away had never been an option. The whispers outside would grow, but inside the farmhouse, something stronger was already being built. The day after the market had left its mark, the whispers Kane had brushed off lingered in the minds of the women, especially Nyril. She worked with silent precision in the fields, her movements sharp, controlled, as though discipline alone could push away the unease. At dinner, she ate little, speaking only when necessary. Kane noticed it. He always noticed. When night fell, the farmhouse grew quiet. The spare room door closed, their voices dimmed to soft murmurs. Kane sat alone at the table, cleaning his tools with methodical care. He thought about the way Nyril had flinched at the market, how her eyes had searched the crowd for threats the way soldiers once did. He thought about Illyria's question, outsiders. That word had cut deeper than she knew. He blew out the lamp and went to his room. The cot creaked as he sat, removing his boots. The silence pressed heavy. Then came a knock, soft, deliberate, not hesitant. He opened the door. Nyril stood there, holding a candle that lit her features in warm gold. Her hair, long and white, was unbound for the first time, falling over her shoulders. Her eyes held no sharpness, only exhaustion she had hidden until now. "I can't sleep," she said simply. Kane stepped aside. She entered without waiting for an invitation, set the candle on the dresser, and stood in the middle of the room. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air was thick with the weight of what wasn't being said. Finally, Kane broke the silence. "You don't have to prove anything here. Not to me. Not to anyone." Nyril's jaw tightened. "You think I'm strong? I'll let you think that because I want it to be true. But every time I close my eyes, I hear the whispers. I see doors shutting. Men who said the same words you did, until they didn't mean them anymore." Kane studied her, arms folded. "I'm not those men." Her eyes searched his face, as if trying to see the lie she had always found before. When she found none, her shoulders sagged. She stepped closer, close enough that he felt her breath against his chest. "I don't want to be alone tonight." Kane's body tensed, not from rejection, but from restraint. His voice was low, steady. "Are you sure?" Nyril lifted her hand, placed it against his arm. Her touch was firm, not trembling. "Yes." He didn't move fast. He let her set the pace. She leaned her forehead to his chest first, testing, waiting to see if he would pull away. He didn't. His hand came up, resting on her shoulder, grounding her. She exhaled, a long, shaky breath that carried weeks of fear. When he finally bent and kissed her, it wasn't hurried. It was slow, deliberate, the way a man kissed someone he respected. Nyril's fingers tightened in his shirt, pulling him closer. For the first time since she had arrived, she allowed herself to tremble, not from fear but release. Later, when they lay on the cot, the candle burned low. Nyril rested against him, her body warm against his side, her hand entwined with his. She didn't speak, and she didn't need to. Kane's arm around her was answer enough. For her, this wasn't surrender. It was choice. Across the hall, the others slept. The farmhouse was still. Outside, the twin moons washed the fields in silver light. Inside, something irreversible had begun. Trust had shifted into intimacy. What had been survival was now more. For the first time since the widows had arrived, Kane felt not just responsibility, but belonging. And he sensed that Nyril did too. The farmhouse carried a different air after that night with Nyril. She moved with more quiet ease the next morning, no longer standing on edge as though waiting for the ground to be taken from beneath her. She spoke more when they worked in the fields, not with long speeches but with small, steady observations. The others noticed it. They weren't blind. A shift like that, inside close walls, didn't stay hidden. Cyrian was the first to react. At dinner, she leaned across the table with her chin propped on her hand, her grin sharp. "So, our farmer is not made of stone after all." Her tone was teasing, but her eyes flicked between Kane and Nyril with something sharper. Curiosity, maybe jealousy. Kane met her gaze evenly, not rising to the bait. Nyril only lowered her eyes to her plate, lips curving in a restrained smile. That night, when the others settled, Cyrian lingered in the kitchen while Kane put away tools. She moved closer, brushing past him deliberately as she reached for a cup. "You keep rules so tight, Kane," she said softly, her shoulder almost grazing his arm. "But maybe rules are meant to be tested." She tilted her head, daring him to react. He didn't pull away. His voice was calm but firm. "Only test what you're ready to live with after." The silence that followed carried weight. Her smile softened, less playful, more real. She leaned forward, kissed his cheek, light, quick, and left him standing by the stove with the faint warmth of her touch still there. Thyrene's response was different. She didn't speak of it, didn't tease, but Kane caught the way her eyes lingered longer than before when he passed her tools, the way her hands brushed his on the fence rail and stayed a fraction too long. She carried herself with pride, but pride didn't stop longing. One evening, after hauling timber until her muscles trembled, she dropped into a chair by the door. Kane crouched beside her, pressed a damp cloth into her hand. She didn't take it at first. Instead, she gripped his wrist, her voice low, stripped of its usual steel. "I don't want to feel weak here." He steadied his gaze on hers. "Then don't. No one's keeping score." For the first time, her expression cracked, and she leaned her forehead against his shoulder, just for a breath, before pushing herself up and walking away. Valeth made no effort to hide her intent. One evening, while the others prepared food, she cornered Kane by the back door. Her blue skin glistened from the heat of the stove, her wrap hanging loose at her shoulder. "Nyril was brave enough to knock first," she murmured, stepping into his space. "But don't think she was the only one watching you." Her hand touched his chest, slow, deliberate. Kane caught her wrist, not to push away, but to slow her. His voice was steady, but rougher now. "I won't take what isn't chosen." Her smile deepened. "This is chosen." She kissed him then, harder, more direct than Nyril had. His restraint held, but only just. When she pulled back, her eyes glowed with satisfaction. "Now you know." And she left him standing with his pulse racing. Illyria was the last to reveal herself, but perhaps the most honest. One night, when the others had already gone to their mats, she stayed by the fire, folding small pieces of cloth into neat stacks. Kane came to check the locks and found her there, her hands trembling slightly, though she tried to hide it. "I hear them whisper at night," she said quietly, eyes fixed on cloth. "The others, they're not afraid anymore. I want that too." She lifted her gaze to him, then vulnerable, searching. Kane sat across from her, close enough that their knees nearly touched. He spoke carefully. "You don't need to hurry. Safety first. Always." She nodded, but her eyes filled with something more, hope, yearning. She leaned forward, just enough that her shoulder brushed his, and whispered, "Safety is why I can finally want." The closeness lingered, her hand resting briefly on his before she stood and left for the spare room. By the end of that week, the farmhouse had become more than shelter. It was a place of unspoken choices, of glances that lingered longer than they once dared, of touches that carried weight. Kane felt the shift pressing on him from all sides. He wasn't naive. He knew what the colony whispered, knew what men muttered at the market. But inside these walls, the truth was different. The widows weren't here because of gossip or necessity anymore. They were here because slowly, one by one, they had chosen to belong. When Kane lay in bed that night, he thought about the path ahead. 5 women under his roof, each carrying scars, each making choices in their own time. His solitude was gone. In its place was something more complicated: desire, loyalty, family forming out of ruin. He had promised them safety. Now, without speaking it aloud, he realized he had promised them more. The farm was no longer just his. It was theirs. The last weeks of the season brought change the way storms did, quiet at first, then impossible to ignore. The farmhouse was no longer a place for strangers. It was a living home. The widows no longer walked with caution in their steps. Their laughter filled the kitchen. Their voices carried out into the fields. Their clothing hung on the lines alongside Kane's shirts. The shift was unmistakable. Kane noticed it most in the evenings, where once they had gone to the spare room together, now they lingered. One by one, each widow had crossed the line from guest to partner, not in grand declarations, but in simple, undeniable choices. Nyril seeking comfort in his bed during the storm, Cyrene pressing her lips to his cheek and daring him to smile. Thyrene resting her forehead against his shoulder when her strength finally cracked, Valeth claiming his mouth with the boldness only she could. Illyria whispering her wants by the fire with trembling honesty. They hadn't asked permission from each other, and Kane hadn't forced order on it. It happened the way crops grew, slow, natural, steady. The community's whispers did not fade, but they no longer mattered. At the market, the stares were sharper now. Yet Kane answered them the same way every time, with a steady gaze and silence that allowed no argument. His land was his home his own. What happened inside it belonged to no one else. Inside, the bond only deepened. Each widow brought her strength to the farm. Nyril's discipline kept order. Cyrene's laughter cut through heavy days. Thyrene's muscle kept fences strong. Valeth's confidence steadied them when doubt crept in. Illyria's gentle hands mended both clothes and spirits. And Cain, in turn, gave them the one thing no one else had offered: constancy. His word held. His arms held. His house held. By the time the first leaves turned gold on the ridge, Nyril carried a swelling at her belly. Valeth followed weeks later, her stride slower, but her eyes still burning with pride. Illyria wept when she realized she was late and laughed through her tears when Cain kissed her forehead instead of asking questions. Cyrian teased about being next, only to fall silent when her time came, pressing Cain's hand to her stomach as if she still couldn't believe it. Even Thyrene, who had resisted softness the longest, finally admitted it one dawn by placing his hand over her own belly without a word. The farmhouse grew louder with every month. New rooms were added with timber. Cain cut himself. The table lengthened, cradles carved and set by the fire. The land thrived. Harvests were heavier than they had been in years. But more than that, life thrived. At night, when the children's cries rose and were soothed, when the widows slept against him in turns, when the walls held the heat of so many bodies, Cain understood that what they had built was not scandal, not rumor, not mistake. It was family. On the final night of that year, the fire crackled on the hearth. Nyril leaned against Cain's chest, eyes half closed. Cyrian curled on the rug, humming softly to the infant in her arms. Valeth teased Thyrene for dozing in her chair, though her own eyelids drooped just as heavily. Illyria moved quietly between them, covering shoulders with blankets, her glow faint in the firelight. Cain looked around the room, taking in the sight of them, women who had arrived with nothing but rain in their hair and fear in their eyes, now warm, full, and alive under his roof. He breathed deeply, his arm wrapped around Nyril, and spoke the truth plainly, his voice low but sure. "This is our home. It always will be." No one argued. They didn't need to. The farmhouse on Seraph. 9 stood against storms and whispers alike. And within it, Cain Rourke, once a solitary farmer with only his land for company, lived surrounded by the family he never expected but now could not imagine being without. It was not survival anymore. It was belonging. The story ended not with questions, but with certainty. The widows had found shelter, Cain had found love, and together they had built a future that no voice outside those walls could take away.